Have you ever wanted to look into retro games but aren't sure where to begin? Do you ever wonder which classic games stand the test of time and which ones don't hold up? These are some questions that have been bothering me for a while now, and I think it's about time to do something about it. So I'm going through gaming's history one game at a time to find the best games of all time. Welcome to the Gaming Archaeologist. With the N64 library behind me, I now embark onto the Game Boy Advance library, which from what I know about it has aged pretty well. Before the GBA, most handheld systems were not very powerful, and couldn't hold a candle to home consoles. As a result, there was a limit to what most games for handhelds could do, and they tended to be little more than glorified time wasters that couldn't match the depth of their home console counterparts. Sure, there were some exceptions, but not many. The Game Boy Advance did a lot to change this, and showed the true potential of handheld gaming. While it was still not as powerful as home consoles, it was powerful enough to allow for deep and engaging experiences. What the system lacked in power, it made up for in elegance. Instead of focusing on graphics or scale, the games could hone in on the mechanics, creating simple but polished experiences, many of which hold up brilliantly even to this day. One prime example of this is Advance Wars, an early title for the GBA that is considered by many to be one of the greatest strategy games ever made. That's a lofty claim, but after sinking countless hours into it over the past year, I'd say it lives up to the hype. And it, along with the Binding of Isaac Rebirth port, are the only reasons my Wii U hasn't been relegated to a glorified dust collector. Advance Wars is, in essence, an elaborate variation of chess, with both sides moving units around a map trying to complete an objective while preventing the other team from completing theirs. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? But where it truly succeeds is in implementation. The game manages to nail being both simple and deep, simultaneously intuitive while also providing a meaty challenge. It does this by breaking the various mechanics down into small manageable chunks, allowing the player time to gradually learn the rules of the game without being overwhelmed. Many older strategy games and RPGs fall into the trap of overloading the player without explaining how the various mechanics work, which makes understanding and learning how the game works a chore. This, combined with the unreasonable but common sink-or-swim attitude when it comes to the difficulty, and you have a recipe for a game that is needlessly hostile towards newcomers. Advance Wars skillfully avoids these problems by appealing to players of all skill levels, at least at the start. This is not to say that the game is easy. On the contrary, many of the challenges and maps are quite difficult, and require smart planning and sound strategy to overcome, but the game understands the importance of starting small and gradually becoming more difficult, rather than hitting the player with tough challenges right off the bat. Besides the gameplay, the art style and characters have also aged quite well. They provide the game with a timeless charm, and unlike other war games, it doesn't take itself too seriously. In addition to the campaign, you can also purchase more maps, and between the Versus maps, the pre-deployed maps, the 3-player and 4-player maps, the War Room, and more, you have a lot of content, and lots of different maps and COs to play around with. And if that's not enough for you, there's also a mode that lets you create your own maps, and for a Game Boy Advance game, it's quite extensive. It does have some annoying limits, such as you can't control the size of the map, and you can only create up to 3 maps at a time, but still, it's a pretty neat feature, and gives players even more to play around with if they're not satisfied with everything else the game has to offer. While Advance Wars is polished nearly to perfection in many areas, it does have its flaws. Some units are not able to attack other types of units, which can be irritating, and in some circumstances makes some units functionally useless. The game would have been better if there was simply a massive damage penalty when certain units try to go up against units they aren't as good against, rather than simply not allowing the option of attack at all. The one exception is the indirect units. Another issue is the main campaign. While it has a decent difficulty curve and does a good job of showing off the various characters and strategies the game has to offer, it's not always structured coherently. The sequence of battles can feel random at times, and the difficulty curve can waver up and down without warning. This may be in large part because the story for the campaign is not very good. It makes very little sense, is needlessly complicated, and doesn't flow very well as a narrative. While I realize story is not this game's focus, having a basic and coherent narrative shouldn't be that difficult. The bulk of the worthwhile content is outside of the main campaign, and while the campaign isn't bad, it's not as good as it could have been. Another issue is that some of the maps occasionally have arbitrary win or lose conditions. For example, some maps require you to protect a particular unit for a certain number of turns because of reasons. In a game like Fire Emblem, which is very character and story based, this makes sense, as each individual unit is distinct and irreplaceable, and you can care about a unit even if they aren't that useful to gameplay. In Advance Wars, however, all of the units are generic and interchangeable, and many maps allow you to build new ones from scratch. So it's rather bizarre that the game would try to make you value one particular unit over another when they have as much personality as a chess piece. Finally, there is the inclusion of Fog of War maps. This is a mechanic I extremely disliked in the Fire Emblem games, and I don't like it much better here, because Fog of War is a mechanic that takes the strategy out of a game that's supposed to be all about strategy. In most maps, if you lose a battle, it's because you made a mistake, or the enemy outmaneuvered you, or you didn't plan ahead. The point is, for most of the game, if the player fails a match, it's entirely their fault. In the Fog of War maps, however, it's almost impossible to make sound decisions because you can't even see the enemy. As a result, the only strategies are either moving like a snail across the map to avoid ambushes, or just rushing ahead and getting slaughtered so you can know where the enemy will be coming from on the next try. I'll grudgingly admit that the Fog of War maps in Advance Wars are marginally better than the ones in Fire Emblem, because the enemy is bound by the same limitations as the player, and there are ways you can use the limited visibility to your advantage. I still don't think it's a good or fair mechanic, but it's at least tolerable here. Beyond those minor issues, Advance Wars is a fantastic strategy game. The gameplay is almost perfectly polished, and it has an enormous amount of content that will provide hours and hours of entertainment. The game may have its flaws, but it definitely deserves all of the praise it gets, and it's a shame that it isn't as well known as Nintendo's other classics. My final score is a 9 out of 10. If you haven't played this game, you need to. Like, now. If you have played Advanced Wars, what did you think? Whatever your thoughts, be sure to let me know in the comments. If you like what I do, feel free to subscribe and follow me on Twitter. The next game I'll be looking at is Fire Emblem Blazing Sword, also known simply as Fire Emblem. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.